Casual Magic has been brought to you by Cool Stuff Inc., where you can get cool stuff. Use the code CASUAL to get 5% off of your sale. And then also by Coalesce Apparel, where you can get really cool t-shirts and stuff, and use the code CASUALMAGIC to get 10% off your sale. And by Archidekt, a deck hosting website that doesn't really sell anything, but they like me and I like them, so kindly use them. And now, on to the show. Hello and welcome to Casual Magic, the show where we talk about the fun side of Magic the Gathering. My name is SHIVAM'S, and Casual Magic is brought to you by Coalesce Apparel, CoolStuffInc, and Archidekt, and you can find all of the various codes and such in the bumper before the show, which means I probably need to just stop recording this part of the show since I did it separately so I wouldn't have to. But, that's just kind of how we roll here. I have an announcement to make before we begin the show. For those of you who listen audio only, I have just moved to YouTube. So now you can find Casual Magic not only anywhere podcasts are sold or at Cool Stuff Inc. every Tuesday, but you can now also find the show in a video form on YouTube, basically like Tuesday or Wednesday, depending on when my editor gets done and kind of just, how fast I do it, really. Probably Wednesday. We haven't figured out the cadence yet. We're still working on it. But the video graphics, it's not like a video, like we don't have my face or anything because I tend to record these late at night. But it's more like, pretty graphics and text boxes and things. But a lot of you have been asking me to be able to put this show on YouTube. And I've resisted for like 100 episodes and change. And so now here we are, and every episode from 100 forward has been put onto YouTube, and we will be going back and filling the backfill as I get around to it, because it's 100 episodes. That's a lot of work. But that is just the pluggy part. Today, I have a very special guest, my friend Chris, the Commander Mechanic. He's got a show on YouTube where he tinkers with people's decks and stuff, and he recently helped me out with a couple of my deck decks, and I thought it would be really interesting to talk to him to see how you can work through figuring out how to fix a deck, either your deck or when somebody else hands you a pile. Because look, I'm a writer, and the thing I know the most about writing is that I give my text to an editor, because when you give your stuff to somebody else, they can look at it without the love and appreciation you have for your own voice, and they can sit there and say, this is garbage, cut all this crap out. And you sit there and say, no, but I love that part. And they say, yeah, but you're losing. And then you're like, yes, I am. And they fix your decks or your text. You publish, everything is great, life is good. Respect your editors, people. It's the most important thing they can do. Hi, Chris. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Shivam, no problem. Thank you for having me on. And like you mentioned, we just worked together on a couple of decks, so I think it's an appropriate time for us to discuss what that process looks like, how
Yeah,
people can refine and tune up, as it were.
yeah, exactly. Because I'm just so fascinated by, like, as we know in Magic the Gathering, there's people who are like brewers, people who basically come
Mhm.
up with a deck, build it, like find the cool things that they can be doing. Then there's deck tuners, folks who will take this list and say like, okay, well, you've got the right idea, but let me shave it into something that's good. And then there's people like me who are like, okay, now that you've done all the work, let me just play the deck.
I think your analogy about an editor is spot on here. In my time writing, in a previous lifetime, and now that I'm writing about magic as well, having an editor means that you can trim out some of the rambles, or you can take
Yes.
out the personal voice out of a lot of stuff, and you get a more concise, more meaningful piece,
Yes.
at least from a practical standpoint.
Right.
There is an objective side and a subjective side to magic, especially when it comes to deck building. And a
Mm.
lot of people just need that extra set of eyes to say, if you want to do the thing, you might have to kill your darlings.
Right. And there's this value in, like, if you're coming up with a deck, and we'll be using concrete examples later on, but if you're like coming up with a deck and you've got an idea, a commander you want to build around, or a theme you want to build around, and your first draft is, here's all of the cards that do this thing.
Mhm.
And then, you sit there and you refine it a bit and you come up with some things. When you hand this deck list to somebody else, they might sit there and be able to look and say, hey, you know what? there was this card printed in, Mercadian masks or something that just happens to synergize perfectly with the things you want to do, even though it doesn't have the keyword on it or doesn't do exactly verbally the thing you want. And having that extra set of eyes is sort of like the level up that just helps your deck go from a cool idea to something that is actually fun to play. Because how many times have
Absolutely.
we built a deck where it's just like, okay, well, it looked good on paper. Yeah.
Being able to show people your deck or playing it with other people and getting their feedback is like beta testing a video game. Right, you
I've done a
never
lot of
know
that.
what kind of bugs or how something works until it's in front of people and they get their hands on it. One of the things that I love to do with my personal play group is let them play my decks and let them show me where things were working or what isn't working. Was this a dead card most of the time? Did I not like seeing that? Were there too many lands? Were there too few lands? And that's one of the reasons why when I work with people on their decks, it's not just a show me your list kind of thing. It's tell me what your deck is doing or not
Yes.
doing so that we can work on that. And I think that that's very important. A lot of people will post a deck list and say, help me, right? You'll
Mhm.
go to the Reddit post and they'll say, hey, my list isn't working. Here's my 99. Give me a hand. You got to dig deeper than that. You got to
Right.
say, what's working for you? What do you like? What don't you like? What are you trying to do?
Especially since in Commander, our whole point is that, when you build a deck, 99 cards is a lot. And
Hmm.
realistically speaking, it's more like 60 cards because we're talking like the rest of the lands, utility, whatever. But when you've got a deck, you've got your multiple themes or your multiple ideas because it's rare to have a deck that is just single focused on doing one thing unless you're literally like me building a one focused single minded deck.
Hmm.
And that's a bad idea because what happens when that one deck gets hosed in the pod? Suddenly you got nothing to do, right? Because you got no B plan. But it's important to help your deck shape an identity
Hmm.
and also to kind of come up with a direction you want to go in because sometimes when you're like, here, let's just move into the practical part of this.
Sure.
So I gave you my neth. Actually, you know what? Um, we should actually first talk about who you are and why would I bring you on here to talk about these things before we get diving really head first. Because
Sure. What are my bona fides for
yeah,
this?
like, tell me, my friend, why would you know how to tinker a deck?
For anybody that hasn't heard of me, I'm Chris and I'm your commander mechanic. I am legally obligated to say that at least once in everything. But you can find me everywhere content is made by searching Commander Mechanic. I started a YouTube channel close to 2 years ago now with the concept of taking what I was doing at my LGS, and that is having people show me their decks and talk to me about their decks, and then giving advice and feedback to the internet. Of course, when the whole global environment changed, let's say I wasn't able to sit in the LGS and have people say, "Here's my weird brew, give me your feedback." So I started a YouTube channel, and in the 2 years, almost 2 years since I've been running it, I've had over 200 decks submitted to me. I have people ping me on Twitter or on Discord and say, "Hey, can you look at a list?" I have people sending me emails or commenting on my videos saying, "Can you look at my deck?" And I think one of the things, apart from seeing hundreds of other people's decks, is that I am a brewer. Like you mentioned, there are people that are brewers, that are tuners. I build hundreds of decks a year.
Hmm.
I build at least 2 decks a week. And in the month of November, I run a big charity event where I brew a deck a day. Uh,
Jeez.
so yeah, it gets to be a lot, and I've been doing it for a while now. I think that my example size, and my experience is pretty broad here. And I mean, in the community, I'm known for building decks that do the thing as well. I think that that's one of the reasons why when we met up in Vegas, you, who had almost no voice whatsoever, came up to me and said, I need you to look at my list.
Yeah, see, that's exactly the thing. Is like I respect you a lot as a deck tuner and builder, and that's why I was like, okay, you know what? I would like you to help me out here because I've got a couple of decks that I really want to make them more than just Pylo cards that I put together.
Right.
Because, like, for instance, we were about to say before I got started here, I have that I've spoken about many times before on the show. I've got a Nethroi deck that I absolutely love. It
Mhm.
started out life as a boxing league deck, so it was like a single Ikoria box that I cracked open, found a like fancy art Nethroi, and I built a full on mutate deck. And then once I finished that boxing league, I was like, you know what? I love this deck. I'm going to just build it into a real deck with all the Abzan cards that I've always wanted to play, things like Siege Rhino or
Mhm.
Phantom Nishoba or whatever, and just random like old timey cards that I just like that are in those colors that I've got nowhere else to put. And I built this combination reanimator slash mutate deck. It's really cool, but it's got a very confused focus. It
Mhm.
doesn't know what it wants to do because, like, one of the things is, like, I build really amazing mutate stacks in here that do crazy nonsense. But then if you kill my mutate stack and they all go to the yard, and then I bring Nethroi back, they reanimate them all from the yard. They all come back as separate pieces, and they're not as mutated pieces. They don't come back to my hand, they come back to play.
Mhm.
And so I need to like I really ought to put that stupid green card that lets you bounce the creature back to your hand to give it
Team or
indestructible.
Sabretooth.
Yes, Sabretooth. I need to put that in here because that would be a really great way to get my mutate triggers back. God, I'm just thinking about that right now. I've been playing this deck for months, and how just now? But yeah, Sabretooth. I need to put that in here because it's in colors and perfect. But I came to you because this deck had an identity crisis. It didn't know
Mhm.
what it wanted to do, and I didn't necessarily know what I wanted it to do because I love both Reanimator and Mutate. Like Mutate's one of my favorite mechanics, and I was really curious to see how can I make this into a deck that works. So when I came to you with this idea, what did you do? How do you go and look at the deck that somebody gives you and start the process?
So the issue that you had with your list is not unique. A lot of people have that where they start out saying, "I want to do this, but this is my backup plan," and then in practice they end up drawing, half of Plan A and half of Plan B, and they
Boy,
don't
howdy.
do anything together. So when somebody brings me a list, I like to ask them questions. Think of it as like a pregame discussion, but for deck building. My whole article series over on Commander's Herald is about crafting a better play experience before you ever sit down at a table through deck building. So it's more for the people that don't build a lot of decks or that tend to build that diffused focus deck or decks that don't have synergies working for them, and helping them with that. Why is this deck not doing the thing?
Mm.
So when somebody brings me a list, I ask them a bunch of questions. I say, "Have you played this? First of all, have you played this, or is this still in theory?" Right? Because
Boy, that question is way more important than you would think because so many times people are just like, theory crafting a list and they put this thing together and they haven't played it. Because one thing is when you're building a list, and this is a problem I think a lot of new commander players run into, especially, is that you'll be building this list and you'll sit there and be like, okay, I'm putting this combo in and I'm putting these three synergistic cards in and I'm putting
yeah,
this thing in, and you build it and you're like, aha, I've got all these things that do stuff, and they're all disparate like individual pieces and combos, and you forget that you have to shuffle your deck and then draw seven random cards out of the 99 that you have there
right.
and hope that you happen to into one of those combos, and then you're like, oh, I've got like six starting parts of a combo and no finishing parts of a combo,
Yeah,
and they're not the same combo. What the hell's going on?
yeah.
And you
Six
don't know that.
piece A's and no piece B's.
Right, and you don't
Right?
know until you actually hit play.
Exactly. And not only that, but I've had people come to me with lists and say, "Well, I haven't played this against people, but I've goldfished it."
That's not
And
even, yeah, I mean, that's close. That's a step up.
but no plan survives contact with the enemy. So keep that in mind
Boy,
as
isn't that
well.
the truth. Because let me tell you, now I am notorious for hating counterspells in EDH because I believe that it's offensive for you to and insulting for you to sit there and stop me from doing the thing that I'm planning to do.
Right.
However, this is Commander. There are four people there who want to do the thing they want to do.
Mhm.
And everybody's plan is going to get disrupted multiple times. So you got to sit there and actually play against somebody who's going to muck around with your board so that
Right.
you can understand, does this do the thing at all, or am I too dependent on you not touching me in order for this to work?
Right, right. Is this plan too fragile? Am I too dependent on my commander? What happens if they get removed 2 or 3 times throughout the course of the game? A lot of people who just goldfish don't take that into account. They don't realize that their 5 mana commander costs 7 and then 9 and then 11. And hey, if that happens, are you actually going to spend 11 mana for this cornerstone piece of your deck?
Yeah, so let me tell you the story, right? Um, I was playing a game against Gavin from the rules committee, and we were sitting there and hanging out and playing. And I built up this big Nethroi stack. It had like 6 mutates on it. It was a just gigantic pile of awesome. It was going to come in, crush his face, and win the game. And he comes in, and he casts a control magic type effect on it, and he just yanks my Nethroi over to his side, and I'm suddenly like, all of my cards are over there.
Yeah.
I have no way of getting this back. Crap.
Yep.
And that's when I learned to play Homeward Path.
Exactly, exactly. So one of my favorite personal builds is Grismold the Dreadsower.
Mm,
A card nobody plays. Like there are less than 100 copies of this deck on EDH Rec. But it's all about getting a lot of counters on this guy and then swinging for big commander damage. But it's a synergistic pile,
it,
right?
it's like it's like a tender shoot dryad, but for everybody.
Right, right. But then you want to kill all of these gifts that you've given everybody to make Grismold really big. And it can be really explosive. You can, one shot people with commander damage really quick in this. But the
Actually, I
number
need
of
you to
times,
send me this deck list because I love Griswold and I want to build that.
yeah.
But yeah,
Uh,
go ahead.
the number of times I've played Grismold, got him big enough to one shot somebody, and then have somebody like use a threaten effect to take him from me and then
Oh,
knock me out with him.
that's the
I
worst.
mean, come on. I've had to put Griswold in commander jail a few times
Oh
because he's
no.
betrayed me once too often.
Sit in the oubliette and think about what you did, my dude.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. When somebody sends me a list, I ask them, have you played this? Have you played this with people? What's it doing for you, or what's it not doing for you? Where are the feel goods and where are the feel bads in
Right.
this? And so, if somebody has confirmed, hey, I've played this against people, here's what it's doing. Here are its weaknesses. Like here's what its perceived weaknesses are. That's when I dive into it and I look at. One of the first things that I look at is sizzle versus steak, right?
Hmm.
And that is what is the ratio of things that do the thing that you want to do versus the ratio of things that care about you doing the thing, right? And you and I talked about that with your Nethroi deck in particular because you said this is part reanimator, but apart from your creatures dying, there wasn't a lot of ways to get stuff into the yard.
Right.
So there was this concept of it being reanimator, but it was after everything dies, I'll pull it all
Yeah.
back.
It was basically a reanimator in response to you wrathing my board and not necessarily me helping my case to get these into the yard.
Right, right. So that's when we talked about the sizzle versus steak here. How many enablers do you have versus how many how many pieces do you have that care about you doing that? And if your commander reanimates a bunch of stuff, you mentioned, hey, half the time I'll mutate Nethroi and pull back one creature because I don't have anything in my yard. So that's one of the first places that I look because that's a feel bad experience. You want to get
Right.
that value out of Nethroi.
Exactly. And that was definitely a problem that I was running into with this deck was like, oh, this deck does mutate really well, but it's got a lot of ways to pull things out of the yard, but like very, very few ways to put things into the yard. And that was something that I was not seeing. I was just having trouble like kind of coming to this myself because I was just looking at like, oh, this would be super fun to pull out of the graveyard, but not like, oh, I have to put in the actual like you have to eat your vegetables, right?
Yeah,
You need to
yeah,
have your like crap that mills you into the deck. Like you need your Stitcher suppliers. You need
yeah.
your like Viscerous ears, right? Like things that'll actually shove stuff into the graveyard.
Right, right. And we talked about a bunch of things to add into there. Like one of my favorites, Mesmeric Orb, right? Which is just one of these value engines that while you're playing the game, it does what you want and then also disrupts other people. So it's kind of like a 2-for-1 kind of thing. But we talked about Stitcher Supplier, and I know Satyr Wayfinder was one that you asked about as well. But these are things that do what you want them to do and get you along your game plan so
Hmm.
that when you want to reanimate stuff, you have the capability to do that, as opposed to saying, I'm casting or I'm mutating this Nethroid with an empty graveyard, right? Really doesn't do a lot.
Yeah, because like when you've got a commander, and I've noticed this not just with Nethroi, but with a number of different decks. When you've got a commander whose job it is to come into play and do something, and you don't have that thing to do, and you just have to play it for value, that is the worst feeling in the world
Feels
because you
real
feel like
bad.
you just wasted the entire, raison d'être of the freaking commander.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Like there are some commanders that fuel themselves or are always good,
Hmm.
and that's fine. But if you're building something that needs a synergy for your commander to do the thing, then you need to build that into your deck, and you need to take that into account.
Yes.
If you don't, you're going to be disappointed, and that's one of the things that hurts me as a brewer and as somebody who sees all of these decks. When somebody tells me I'm taking this deck apart because it doesn't do the thing.
Hmm.
I mean, like, look, people get emotionally attached to their decks, and that is one of the best things about our format is that people
Yeah.
can be emotionally invested in their decks. They can have that nostalgia for it. It might remind them of a point in time or their favorite set or a person. And for them to then say, I want to take this apart because it no longer does the thing. I mean, like, let's take a look at it before you throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Seriously. It's just like it's really complicated sometimes to come up with these piles that you have to, like, I mean, so okay. So let's say that I give you this deck pile. What is the first thing that you would look at? So you and I, we both had this lengthy discussion about these two decks, both my Mardu Treasures deck and my
Mhm.
Nethroi Reanimator deck, which were neither of them were doing the thing. And I said, okay, help me figure out what this deck wants to do because I'm having a hard time trying to split the difference here.
Right.
Help me make this into a more fun experience. So when I gave you this list, what was the first thing you looked at?
So after asking you what you wanted to do and you telling me, what it was that you wanted and why it wasn't doing the thing,
Hmm.
uh, I looked at your enablers. So the things that help you to do the thing. Sorry, I'm saying thing a lot
Yeah, I
here.
mean, like, to help you perform the task that your deck wants to do, right? Like, what's your goal?
Right. To go to my mechanic analogies, it's the gas in the engine, right? You
Sure.
need something to be the catalyst to start the whole thing going. And in the case of your treasures deck, it was things that make treasures. And when I looked at the list, I saw that you had 12 cards in the list that made treasures, but close to 20 cards in the list that cared about artifacts entering the battlefield or dying. So
Yes.
you had more sizzle than steak in that list. So the first thing that I said is let's cut some of these synergy pieces, the things that care if you're already doing the thing, for more pieces that do the thing. So that more consistently you can make treasures, so that when
Yes.
you draw the pieces that care about you making treasures, you are already there.
Right. Because that was one of the things, like, sometimes you sit there and you're looking at your deck and you're like, why isn't this actually making, like, for instance, my Mardu Treasures deck, it was having the biggest problem in the world of actually, like you just said, I had a 25 different cards that actually were like, if you have a treasure, 30 things happen.
Right.
But I was the only things I was getting treasures off of were like, smothering tithe or some random, like, one off, two offs because there's no freaking old gnawbones in Mardu for some reason.
Right. Right.
Um, but yeah, you were like, hey, you know what? You have all these different ways to use this stuff. Like I had a bunch of big creatures, mere battle sphere, or like hangerback walker, etc.
Mhm.
And there were not just like the bread and butter stuff that it hits you, it makes treasure. And you need that stuff. And it turns out that that was like, he changed like 4 cards. I changed 4 cards from my deck based on this list that he'd given me, and in those 4 cards, I was able to basically generate something like 25, 26 treasure, which then enabled my deck to entirely pop off
Right.
and do just absurd things in a game. And sometimes it's that easy. It's not like you have to remake the entire 100 cards.
Right.
Sometimes you just need to find these flashpoints that are like pivots on your deck, just swap them out for something else, and it's like turbocharging your engine.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's a big misconception when somebody hands me their deck. They expect me to rework it entirely, take the 99 from the ground up. In most cases, I'm changing 5 to 15% of a deck, so 5 to 15 cards in a
Mm.
deck to just make it do what you want it to do better. And like you said, we made 4 or 5 swaps in your deck, and you told me the next day the deck popped off, which
It
was
was
fantastic.
okay. So basically, I had this deck where let me see if I can remember exactly what happened because it was pretty bananas here. I had Grim Hireling in play. Grim Hireling is this card that says when you do combat damage, you make 2 treasures, right? Like, and then I had Academy Manufactor, which
My
is
favorite
whenever you
card
make a
ever.
treasure, you also make a clue and a food. And I was like, all right, cool, clue, food, treasure, fine. And then I had Reckless Fireweaver, who is like, hey, every time an artifact comes into play, do a point of damage to someone. So I'm
Yeah.
like, oh, so you're saying if I hit something with a Grim Hireling or with any of my creatures, I suddenly get an extra 6 points of damage just off the top.
To everybody, right?
It's
Like, that's huge.
gross. It's
Yeah.
gross.
And
Oh my
that's
god.
where you go from your concept to action to synergy. And the 3 pieces that you mentioned there are what gets the engine going. So the
Mhm.
Grim Hireling that creates treasure tokens, that's the energy. So that's the gas, right? So that's the
Right,
fuel in the engine. Then the Academy Manufactor, that's turbocharging that. That's the
right.
NOS in the engine. And then the Reckless Fireweaver, that's the spark. And that's what starts taking the concept of I'm making treasures, now I'm making a bunch of tokens, now I'm doing a bunch of damage to the table. And you go from I'm doing the thing, making treasures, to I'm doing the thing better, to I'm doing the thing that's going to end the game. And you can see how that funnel widens like that.
And let me tell you guys, Fathom Fleet Swordjack, this uncommon from friggin' Commander Legend, might be one of the best cards I've ever played. Because it says when it attacks, it does damage to player or planeswalker it's attacking equal to the number of artifacts you control,
Oh yeah.
which in a treasures deck can be absurd.
Absolutely, absolutely. When I took a look at the list, you were like, there are a couple of cards in here that I built this list for. It was that one and Reckless Fireweaver, and I'm like, yes, 100%. I'm on board. Let's make
Yeah.
this do the
So
thing.
let me tell you something, dude. Like I had Kalane out. Kalane is the card that says when you pay you add a 1/1 counter to a creature for each treasure that you use to cast it.
Yep.
So I used that to cast my commander Nadir. So Nadir costs 6. When I crack 6 treasures and he comes in as a 12/12.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Oh god, let me tell you. So I had on the table a 12/12 Nadir and a 15/15 Hangerback Walker, and
Gross.
it got real stupid really, really quickly.
Oh, when you get to do that, so with Kalane out, sacrificing treasures to cast something like a Marionette Master. So now
Mhm.
when every treasure you pop is doming somebody for like 12,
Oh,
like
it's gross. It is
it's so
just
good.
absolutely filthy.
Right?
And dude
And that's that's a big part of taking a look at somebody's deck, because that joy that I'm looking at on your face right now is what everybody should feel about their deck. You don't build a deck and it doesn't do the thing. That doesn't spark joy.
Right.
Uh, you want to play your deck, and even if it doesn't do the thing all the time, or somebody gets to do the thing faster, revel in your deck getting to do what you built it to
Oh, dude,
do.
there's no joy like when your deck pops off. Like I remember the first so my soldiers deck is one of my it's my pet deck. It's the deck that I play like, the most. I've had it the longest, whatever. It's also one of my worst decks. And at one point, I mean, it's objectively like the tribe itself is not very strong. The deck is very dependent on theme because I wanted it to be, and
Mhm.
so it's just by default not gonna be very strong. But that's fine. But at some point in there, I was like, you know what? I'm just gonna put an Embercleave in here instead of some random card. And it turns out Embercleave. Embercleave makes your
It's
deck work a
legit.
lot better.
Oh, yeah. Well,
Embercleave
that's
and
your
Aurelia.
Assemble the Legion deck, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. And, like, Assemble the Legion, a pet card of yours, I know that you've talked about it before, we've talked about it in the past, but you get something like an Assemble the Legion out, and then you drop an Anointed Procession as
Dude,
well, and suddenly you are the problem.
if you are living the dream, you've got an anointed procession, assemble the legion, and a divine visitation.
Oh, there you go, so they're
And
all
that's
angels.
when every turn you're getting just geometrically more angels. And it's just gross. You
Oh,
never get
absolutely.
there, but it's a nice dream to live.
Yeah,
No, that deck wins far more often with the fact that Aurelia the War Leader gives you extra combat steps.
yeah.
And it turns out that like if you have extra combat steps and if you have Ember Cleave, you're gonna just do dumb things.
Oh, absolutely. Between, like, Embercleave and the sort of X and Y stuff, like,
Oh god, I love it.
if you're relying on combat, your deck's going to do the thing pretty often because you can always turn a dork sideways. That's what your deck's going to do. But if you want to build something that's synergistic and doesn't want to win through combat damage, that's when you need to take a look at the deck and say, more than is this just a guy that's going to turn sideways, right? If your deck is all about drawing cards, how many cards in your deck allow you to draw more cards, right? Are you playing the Consecrated Sphinxes? Are you going
One of the
to
problems with
risk
card drawing
studies?
decks, though, is like I've seen a lot of decks like in Cube or Commander stuff where their whole point is to just draw a whole bunch of cards. And at that point, your deck becomes a Dominion deck and not a Magic deck,
Right.
where you're just like drawing and drawing and drawing and drawing. And you've got nothing to do because you're just drawing into more draw and you forget to have an output for all this stuff.
Yeah.
Um, but like when you're looking at a deck,
Mhm.
and you've seen this problem, like, what are the places that you look first to see like we talked about already, like, you're looking, "Okay, does this deck do the thing that you wanna do?" How do you come up with cards to swap in then once we've identified what pops out to you as a card that is weak, for instance, that would need to be cut?
Once I get an idea of what somebody wants to do, I take a look at, like I said, the ratio of things that do the thing versus care if you're doing the thing. I
Right.
also take a look at mana bases. I'm very critical of mana bases because a mana base lets you play on curve or off curve, and
I
that's
think it's
very
simpler to
important.
just say a mana base lets you play or not
Yes,
play.
right, exactly, exactly. And I get no end of flack from my friends because when they show me a deck, even if we're just like sitting around brewing, shooting the crap, they'll say, "All right, Chris, what do you think of the curve?" Because they know that that's one of the first places that I go, and I'm like, "What's your curve look like? Does your land support your curve?" And if you're playing a bunch of tapped lands, that means that you're playing a turn slower than your opponents if you aren't able to access that mana right away. So I always say to people, like, if you've got 36 land in your deck and 30 of them are non-basic lands, play more basics first of all, because a basic comes into play untapped and makes you a mana right away. That's fantastic. That's a lot better than a lot of the other cards that people might be cramming into their deck. But I also say cut cards that don't do anything when you play them. And
Mm.
one of my main offenders here is Temple of the False God. I've gone on rants and rants and rants about this, but Temple of the False God for the first 4 turns of the game does nothing. It eats up one of your land drops and does nothing. Sure, the best
Temple of the
case
False
scenario
God
is it makes you 2 land, but or makes you 2 mana rather.
eventually does. I mean,
Ex-
Temple of the False God is one of those cards that reminds me of the original Mulligan rule from like Alpha Beta Unlimited, where it was like y- you draw 7 cards, and if all 7 are lands or 0 are lands, you get to Mulligan. Otherwise, you have to keep it. And if one of the cards in your 7 is a Maze of Ith, and the other 7 are like creatures or whatever, Maze of Ith doesn't tap for mana, but it still
but
says
it's a
land.
land. Yep.
You don't get to Mulligan, and that's when you sit there and learn. I need to play more actual lands.
Right, right. And something like Maze of Ith is a perfect example of this too, right? It eats up your land drop for the turn, but doesn't let you cast any spells. So now you're a turn slower than everybody else at the table. And that's tempo, that's curve. And when you learn to play on curve or you learn to really assess what your curve looks like or what your critical turns in a curve are. So, where does your commander sit in your curve? Where is your ramp in your curve? Where can you afford to have it in your curve? At what turn am I casting on average 2 spells a turn? That's your deck working for you as opposed to working against you. So if you've got a 3 mana commander, do you want your ramp at 1, 2, or 3 mana? Well, if you want it at 1 so that you can cast your commander a turn ahead of the curve, right? So, do you play the cultivates? Do you play the Kodama's reaches? I mean, if you
Mm-hmm.
want to lean into your commander and your commander is essential for your game plan, maybe not because you just care about hitting 3 mana fast. And then you care about hitting 6 mana because if three is your average mana cost, that's your break point where you get to cast 2 spells a turn. So when you look at that, you look at when am I casting my commander? When can I cast 2 spells a turn? And
Mm-hmm.
that's when your deck starts working for
Boy, casting 2 spells a turn, I wonder what that's like. Like,
you.
actually, one of these days I'll play a deck that has 2 spells I can cast, because look, I'm that kind of commander player that likes to play things that have a lot of mana symbols in it.
Yeah.
Like, I want big, expensive, ugly spells to play. Um, but so yeah, you're looking at your mana curves, you're looking at these pieces, because one of the things is, like we mentioned earlier on, is that a problem players run into a lot is they don't have a focus for their deck.
Hmm.
Sometimes it ends up being, here's all my favorite things, good stuff deck, or like, here's a bunch of, like, how do you make sure that the deck has still got a theme and is still playable while leaving room for things like pet cards, things like a mimic vat, or random just spells that don't necessarily do the theme, but are just good, fun commander spells to play. You know what I'm
And,
talking about? Like some of these things that are just like big classic honkers of the format, but they don't necessarily jive with the exact theme of the deck.
and there's always going to be room in a deck for the fun ofs,
Hmm.
as I call them. The pet cards, the stuff that you've got a sentimental attachment to. If you're playing a color, you're going to be playing this card in the color because it's your favorite thing in the world. And that's the subjective attachment that people have to decks and their cards and their games. And the last thing that I want is to take that from them. So I just want to make sure that, hey, if plan A is to do the thing, plan B is to then play the cards that you like as well. If that happens to overlap with your original plan with plan A, then that's a synergy and that's fantastic. If you love Mirror Battlesphere, that's great. It doesn't have to do anything with the rest of your deck. It can be a curve topper. And that's one of the things that I say is typically the high end of your curve is where you've got these big splashy cards to play around with. They don't have to do plan A. They can be, I'm going to get to turn 8 and I'm going to cast this reshape the earth and put 10 lands from my library onto the battlefield because I love that, or because I want to go get these non-basic lands and put them into play. Or maybe it's a Field of the Dead and suddenly I'm making 10 zombies with it as well, even
Yes.
though that has nothing to do with my game plan because I love that kind of play. More power to you. I always ensure that somebody has room in their deck for those fun cards. And when I talk to somebody about their deck, I say, are there any hands off cards in here?
Hmm.
Are there any, these are non negotiable, they stay in the deck?
That is so important. And yes, you told me to take out Mere Battlefield. I did not. I am not taking out my beloved Battle Ball. That's not going to happen.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
it's that card, I think, is it's weird. Like, people are like, "Oh, Soul Ring is like I mean, and I say this all the time, Soul Ring is a fundamental pillar of Commander." But one of the other cards that is just a fundamental pillar of Commander to me is like, right up there with Sakura Tribe Elder is Mere Battlesphere,
Yeah.
which is like just such a good card. It's so much fun to play. But the point you were making though is that like for instance, when I was first really starting to delve into this stuff and I wanted to build a Brea deck. I
Mhm.
wanted to build a Brea Thopters deck. And I wanted to be themed around, Piankir and Nilar. I wanted to and around like Chandra and like Kaladesh themed and have all my like, Thopter makers and Thopter combos and put out a ton of tokens. And I gave it to a friend of mine to help me edit it. And the first thing he did was went through and cut out every single one of my pet cards. Like he went and was like, "Okay, well, you're not putting Gear Crafter in here. You're not putting, you know, like all these random things like, Thopter spy network and all this other stuff." I'm like, but that's the deck. And I'm just watching like the deck just get steadily put into the trash pile. And I'm like, what am I left with? And what he built me was this basically artifact good stuff combo deck that just kind of backwards into like, I mean, it's fun. It's a hell of fun to play because accidentally, whoops, I just comboed off and I didn't even see it because there was like 30 different combos. But it's not the deck I wanted to build.
Right. It does the thing, but it doesn't
It
spark
does
joy.
a thing, but it doesn't do the thing I mean, sure, I can combo off with Thopters and Eldrazi Displacer and whatever. I mean, there's stuff there, but it's not what I had set out to build.
Right.
And, like, it's like you go there with a rough sculpture, and the guy comes and takes a jackhammer and gives you a different sculpture that was, like, carved out of the leg of the thing that you like, if you give him Michelangelo's David and he comes back with the sculpture of a medieval turkey leg, and you're like, I gave you a very large sculpture. He's like, yeah, but all that was crap. This is what you actually wanted to do. It's like, don't do that, guys. Don't like look and find out what the deck is supposed to do and try to shape it to that. Don't try to be like, what you actually want to do is this.
Right, right. And one of my my mottos is don't let people tell you how to play Commander. Play it the way that you want it. If you ask somebody for advice, it's just that. It's advice. You can take or leave it. And if somebody gives you advice to cut your favorite cards, your pet cards, your darlings, you can say, "No, this is firm ground. I'm not going to do that." And that's perfectly fine.
But there's also a point where you have to sit there and actually think about like, okay, is this actually is this in here because it's cool and it makes me smile, or is it literally not helping me do the thing?
Right,
Right.
and that's why I said, at the outset, sometimes you gotta kill your darlings, right? Sometimes
Yeah.
you might say, "Is it worth hurting this deck to include my pet cards in it? Is the deck and what the deck does more important to me than this one card in the deck?" And sometimes it takes the objectivity of another set of eyes to say, "I know you love this card, but it's actively working against you."
Yeah. It's just like this is not helping you. This is not doing the thing you want. You put it in here because you thought it was cute or cool or something. It gave you a smile once, but every time you draw it, do you actually play it? The answer is no. You look at this card and you're trying to find a place to use it or a place to play it, but it's never jamming with the other cards you've got, and you end up just losing. And that sucks. That feeling sucks. And it sometimes takes somebody to look at this and say, like, look, man, that's just not build a different deck that will maximize this thing, but this isn't the deck for that.
Right, right. I've got a buddy, Carson, love him. He jams Phyrexian Triniform in every deck that he can.
I
It's a
love that card.
9 mana spell.
I was
I
actually thinking
sat
of putting that into my treasures deck.
well, I sat down with him and I said, "How many games can you recall that you've had Phyrexian Triniform in your hand at the end of the game, never being able to cast him, never having that opportunity?" And he was like, "Oh, maybe I've cast him 1 out of every 10 games, and the rest of the time, if I draw him, he's just a dead card in my hand." Sometimes you need somebody to say, look, the game only goes on so long, right? On average, there are only 2 or 3 spells over 8 mana value cast in an entire game. Is it worth putting a 9 mana card in your deck?
And but here's the thing though, sometimes it absolutely is worth it. And you've gotta just be able to make that judgment and sit there and say like, "Okay, is this going to help me? Does this do what I think it does?"
Mhm.
And if it does, hey man, go for it, knock yourself out, win the game. But if it's actually just making you feel bad every time you pull it out of the deck, then maybe you need to sit there and really stop and look and say like, "Okay, this is not this is not doing the thing I want to do."
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, we had that conversation about Mirror Battlesphere, right? And in your treasures deck in particular, it still is an artifact that makes more artifacts.
Yeah.
And that is still a synergy piece. Even though it doesn't make treasures, it still works
It
towards the
still
goal of
works
the
with
deck.
all of the different things that care about tokens coming into play in my deck. And the thing is, the deck does actually need ways to win. and that is one of the ways to win is to hit people with the mirror battlesphere. I mean, it's not like in my Brea deck, I have weird things that end up with like cloning that and making a whole ton of different like bouncing your mirror battlesphere and getting 30 mirror and whatever. But sometimes though you look at your things and you're like I had Doretti iconic ingenious iconoclast in that deck.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that card is cool. It's very neat. It's like, okay, this is an artifact deck. Maybe this is a place to put it. But it turns out Doretti actually doesn't do anything with the stuff that I cared about. Like,
Right.
yeah, I could sack an artifact to destroy an artifact or creature. Okay, fine. That's maybe something I could do. But I have like other cards that do that. I'm already playing red and black. Right? Like I have plenty of ways to destroy creatures and artifacts.
Exactly. Exactly.
And the ultimate wasn't gonna help because it's like that doesn't do anything for treasures, which are tokens. It cares about artifacts in the graveyard. And it makes its +1 just makes a random wall that was doing me nothing.
Right.
And it was just there because I didn't know where else to put it. But you were like, "Hey, man, swap this out for a card that actually gives you your deck something to do." Right?
Yeah.
And in that, it just really, like, shifted like, you ended up giving me Unexpected Windfall, for instance, which is the instant speed, Faithless Looting that also makes 2 treasures.
Yes.
And that changes the game because A, it's drawing me cards, B, it's giving me treasures, C, it's putting stuff in the yard for other random reasons, but it's far more synergistic to what the deck wants to do than Doretti ever was, who was just there because he was in the colors.
Right. And like, look, Duretti Ingenious Iconoclast, there is a spot for him somewhere out there. There's a deck that he's going to fit in. But if you're running a treasures deck, you only have so much room for stuff that doesn't make treasures or care about treasures. And
Mhm.
unfortunately, Duretti did neither of those. So that means that when you draw him, he is neither gas nor spark. And if something doesn't do the thing or care about you doing the thing, then it's on the chopping block.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's tricky sometimes because it's hard to sit there and figure out like what is a card that I need to synergize to make this deck work versus what is a card that I'm playing because I don't have another place and I want to play it.
Yeah,
And
I,
yeah, go
and
ahead.
that's the objectivity versus the subjectivity to this. Sometimes
Right.
you look at a card and you say, "I want to play that card," but you need somebody else to come in and say, "Should you be playing that card?"
Right.
And sometimes you put your foot down. You say, "I'm playing this card regardless because it means something to me." And sometimes you say, "Yeah, you know what? You're right. As an editor, that line is a little too verbose. I'll trim it down."
And it's important to remember though, sometimes you just want to try a card out and
Yeah.
you just want to play it once, see like, okay, this is cool. That was fun. That did a thing. Did it do the thing I wanted to do? Nah, maybe not, and then you pull it out. Like, for instance, I had Outlaw's Merriment, which is a card that I'm really, really excited to try to figure out a place to use. It's a card that I love because it randomly makes a token every turn. It's very, very powerful, and it's right there in the, Assemble the Legion line of cards that
Mhm.
I wanna use. And I played it last night and in this treasures deck, and I realized with all of the other treasures and crap that I've got on the table, this card is both a little slower than I mean, it's not necessarily slow, it's still cool because everything comes into play with haste,
Mhm.
and everything actually does stuff when it comes into play, but it's also just I have so much crap on the table. Do I need another card that's just making random crap I have to keep track of? Or
Right.
can I replace that with something that'll help me further this treasure theme? Because these outlaws, there's a vague treasure connection in that they're, like, stealing treasure, they're outlaws, they're Robin Hood's men,
Mhm.
um, but it's not necessarily like Hoarding Ogre, you know, or
Right.
Zorn,
Yeah,
which is
and
like
there are some synergies in there. Like you've got your Nadir's Nightblades that care about
God,
tokens
Nadir's
dying.
Nightblade is such a good card.
It is. It is. I won a game with it last night as well. After going off with Academy Manufactor of all cards. But
Those 2 cards I love so much.
oh yeah, Academy Manufactor is my card of last year. I put a video of it of my cards, my best cards in every color, and best card of the year. And Academy Manufactor is best card of the year for me from last year. Uh,
It's
Honestly,
definitely the card I've had the most fun with from last year.
yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
for real. It's one of those ones that I never dislike seeing because now that they've printed so much stuff that makes treasures or food or clues, it can go in just about any deck and do something.
It actually means that I wanna really, because I wanna build a food deck really, really badly, because
Mhm.
I love a lot of those food cards from, like, there's that giant that can come back from the graveyard if you, like, sack 3 food or whatever,
Yeah,
and with Academy Manufactor and stuff, it's like suddenly these things become much more viable and
right.
more fun, and I'm just super excited to buy, like, 7 more copies and build around it.
Exactly, exactly. And let me tell you, there are no alter sleeves for it. I sit there on that page and I refresh that page looking for new alter sleeves for Academy Manufactor, and nobody uploads any. That's a crime. I want to have a plea out there for everybody listening. Please, a talented artist, do some kind of alter sleeve for Academy Manufactor because I will
That
be
card is
first in
awesome.
line for it.
Yeah, so and then so basically, you sit there, you look for, first off, what is weak in the deck. Second off, what you can add in, like, that would synergize better. And then you offer these suggestions, and they sit there and say, like, okay, well, let me take a handful of these cards and change it and see what happens. Because you don't always have to take the suggestions that they give you. They are just suggestions.
Mhm.
And sometimes you're like, look, I know this card plays better than you think it does. I'm going to keep it because it does the thing I want it to do.
Exactly.
But I'm really curious, and since we're coming kind of close here to the end here, how do you find cards that you think would work better than the cards in there? Like, I think this is the thing that most people kind of struggle with. It's like, I put all the cards I know. What do you mean there's something better? How do I understand that?
Uh, I mean, I'm a little weird in that I have like a near encyclopedic knowledge of
Okay, well,
Magic
there is
cards,
that. Yeah.
right? So that really helps when somebody says like, "Hey, I need something to go with card A." I can list off like 4 or 5 cards that are card Bs to go with that. But I mean, that's part of looking at so many decks all the time
Yeah.
and playing Magic for 20 years at this point, right? Over 20 years at this point. You just absorb these kind of things. But also, having seen things work and building as many decks as I build and play personally, I know what works with what, or I've seen
Right.
somebody play cards that work well together. So I have these sample sizes that I have firsthand because not only am I a builder, not only am I a brewer, but I love to sit down and play too. I always say that the brewer's paradox is that you build more decks than you play.
Ain't that
Uh,
the truth?
Right, right. And I mean, I just did a whole article on New Year's resolution, and the number one New Year's resolution that people told me that they made for Magic for 2022 is play more Magic. I mean, take that to heart, right? But I sit down and I build half of the decks that I make. So I'm tearing apart and putting together a new deck every other week, kind of thing, to actually play. So when I'm playing on stream, or when I'm playing on Spell Table, or when I'm playing with my personal play groups, pandemic permitting, uh, I actually get hands-on experience with this. So this isn't coming from nowhere. I'm not pulling these out of like EDH rack, or I'm not pulling them out of random Scryfall searches. Sometimes I am. Sometimes I do a lot of discovery that way. But I want to see cards work well together. I put decks together and test them. I might run one of the deck builders playtesting tools through Spell Table to play the deck against other people as well to make sure that it's doing the thing. Swap cards out. When I get a deck to do a tune up, I take a week with the deck and I look at it, I look at the list, I make initial changes, I walk away from it, I come back to it, I reconsider it. A lot of the times it's like being a writer and having an editor. And those first passes that you do at it lets you walk away from it and come back to it with semi fresh eyes. But then you play it with other people, and people tell you, hey, did that card do a thing? How did I feel about playing that card? Did those two work well together? And if that's the case, then you've got a hit on your hands. Sometimes you say, initially, I put these 3 cards in the deck. I ran 10 rounds with this deck, and those 3 cards did nothing for me. Swap them out for something else.
Mhm. Mhm. That's, I think, the fundamental truth here is that play your deck. Try it out. Actually see if that stupid card does what you think it does when you think it does. Because there are so many times when you look at a deck, look at a card, and on the face of it, boy, this looks like something that's going to do exactly the thing. And then you're like, wow, this sits in my hand 9 out of 9 games. I got it.
Exactly.
And it's just like, oof, oof, oof. That
That's feel
sucks.
bads, right? The last thing that you want is somebody feeling bad because they sat down at a table and they couldn't play Magic, and it's nobody's fault but their own decks. Sometimes you're going to have games that work that way. Sometimes it's just going to be a variance thing. But sometimes you sit there and your curve is so far off that you're there for 4 turns with nothing but 6 and 8 drops in your hand. And you need somebody to tell you, maybe you need to think about that a little bit. And that's where I get people saying, hey, here's my deck list. And you can tell a lot about where a person is at in their Magic journey from their deck lists as well. Sometimes it's, I just want to jam these cards that I got in draft into a deck, or I started playing Magic 10 years ago, here's all of my old cards that I pulled out of storage recently.
Hmm.
Let me tell you, I got an email recently from a viewer who told me that he and his brother played Magic as kids, and his brother recently passed away. And he was cleaning his brother's house out and found his old collection of Magic cards. So he wants to get back into Magic by making a commander deck with all of these old cards. And
Hmm.
he put just a list of all of these cards together and said, Chris, can you make me something out of this? And seeing that, that's not, hey, I've played around with this. This is, I am so emotionally attached to this. I want you to help me make something out of that. That is an entirely different pivot on this.
Hmm.
Sometimes you get a deck list where, like, hey, I want to do the thing. Sometimes you get a deck list where it's, I want to feel the thing, or I want to be reminded about the thing. And that's where this goes from, hey, I'm objective commander mechanic, to me sobbing as I'm reading an email and going through a list of cards because, these things tug on my heartstrings. It's amazing to see. And when you give somebody a list and you say, hey, here's a thing, play it for me, and they come back and they say, look, I played Magic for the first time in over 10 years and I had a great time. Oh my God. That is the best feeling ever.
That is the truth. Well, my friend, this has been really educational, and I actually appreciate it because I know, like, when we sat down to talk, you were like, "Hey, let's make time to talk about your decks." And I'm like, "What do you mean talk about my decks over PM or
Mhm.
something?" No, we sat down and literally had a Discord call for like half an hour, 45 minutes, breaking these decks down.
Yeah.
And I found that to be tremendously instructive and really, really helpful. And so I hope that our listeners today will be able to sit and look at their decks and try to figure out ways to kind of like, I know we spoke at a very high level here, but
Mhm.
really that's all I mean, it's hard to, you can't drill down because everybody's deck is unique and different. But at least it's good to sit there and put your deck aside and come back and say, like, yo, does this do the thing? And then find out if it does or not.
Yeah.
But if people wanted to find you, where would they go?
People can search for Commander Mechanic everywhere that they'll legally let me make content, from YouTube to Twitter to TikTok and Twitch. Look for the orange wrench and you'll find me. I am Chris, your Commander Mechanic.
Cool. And as always, you can find me on Twitter at GearPoryGears. You can find Casual Magic anywhere podcasts are sold, or at Cool Stuff Inc. on Tuesdays, or on YouTube now. Casual Magic has been brought to you by Cool Stuff Inc., Coalesce Apparel, and Archidekt. And remember, my friends, it is not magic without the gathering, and we will see you